The god's wood had not thawed by midday. The red leaves of the heart tree hung soft and damp after a night of slow snow, and frost lined the edges of the ancient face like white whiskers. John stood beneath it with his cloak wrapped close and ghost silent at his side, red eyes catching the pale, thin light that filtered through the branches. He listened to the creak and broken drip of ice as though the old gods spoke in it, though the words that mattered reached him from men of flesh and breath. Bran sat in his wheeled chair across the roots, hands folded on his lap, a king's stillness in a boy's body. Samwell Tarly shifted his weight and hugged a oilskin-wrapped bundle to his chest, trying not to stamp his feet though his toes were freezing. Davos Seaworth stood a little apart, the snow melting in his beard and dripping off the scar ridging his cheek, steady as a rock set down among saplings. "Say it again," John told Sam, though the words had scoured him clean already, though he could feel them like the scrape of a whetstone each time. "All of it." Sam swallowed and glanced toward Bran, who gave no more sign of impatience than the tree itself. "When I was at the Citadel," Sam began, "I copied pages from an old High Septon's private records. Septon Maynard. He kept a lot of lists." He tried a smile that failed against the cold and the weight of what he carried. He recorded an annulment for Prince Rhaegar Targaryen, of his marriage to Princess Elia of Dorne. Sam took a breath that puffed white in the air. "And then a marriage performed in Dorne in secret, to Lyanna Stark." The name fell into the god's wood and seemed to be taken up by the tree. John's breath ran thin for a heartbeat. He had known, Bran had told him, had watched with eyes that looked beyond. And yet to hear it so hard and worldly from Sam's pink, earnest mouth was to have the ground move again beneath his boots. "And you saw it," Davos said to Bran, more a statement than a question. He had met sorcery at sea, in storm and fire. He had the look of a man who had accepted the cost of believing. Bran's gaze did not change. "I see what was and is and could have been. I saw my aunt and Rhaegar. I heard vows spoken. I watched my mother place you in my father's arms and ask him to keep you safe." His eyes held John's, flat and colorless as winter sky. "You were named Aegon." Ghost lifted his head and huffed, as if speaking to a scent only he sensed. The snow went soft again, a hush under the roots. "I am your lord Bran," John said, voice rough, the old refuge. "I am your brother." "You are both," Bran replied. "You were raised by our father. You are the blood of Ned Stark. And you are Aegon Targaryen, the last son of Rhaegar. Both truths live in you." Sam eased forward a step. If you show this to the realm, if the lords see the record and hear witnesses." "The realm," Davos cut in gently, "is not a straight spear, Sam. It bends to wind and blows back. There's a queen with a dragon waiting in the south, 2 if we're lucked into trouble, and another queen in the city with a lion's teeth and a scorpion's sting. Truth alone rarely wins a war." John looked down at the black-barked roots. A crow hopped somewhere beyond the wall and cawed once, raw as a laugh. He heard Sansa's steps before he saw her, measured and dry in the snow. The sound always carried when she had set her mind to something. "You'll have more than war if you announce this in the wrong hall," she said. Her hood was up. Frost clung to the brown fur at her throat and to the red hair that had slipped free. She stood where she could see Bran and Sam and John at once. Daenerys will see betrayal. Men like Yohn Royce will see cause and law. The River Lords will see a fire that could be theirs if it leaps the right fence. She lifted her chin a fraction. "But there is a way to show the realm this truth and let them claim it as their own, if that's what they decide." John knew before he asked. The word had been on Tyrion's tongue as a suggestion and on Varys' parchment as a plan, skittering beneath doors, something old made new by desperation. "A great council," Sansa said, and the words made a hollow place in the air, as if the tree had drawn in a breath to hear them. Sam blinked. Davos rubbed his lips with thumb and forefinger. Bran watched. "The last 2 were called at Harrenhal," Sansa continued. "In the year 101 after the conquest, the lords chose Viserys over Rhaenys' son. And again when Mikar died, The lords passed over Eamon and Enys and Arian's son and chose Aegon, the fifth of his name. She heard herself say the dead names cleanly. We are a people of custom even when we forget it. If the lords of the realm see the proof and hear the witnesses, if they are allowed to decide, they are more likely to hold to their decision. And if they choose Daenerys, Jon said, we will have avoided a war among the living we can ill afford, and we will have taken the teeth from Cersei's lies, Sansa said. If the Dragon Queen is chosen by Westerosi law, she is not a foreign invader who means to burn a city. And if they choose you, it will be by their will. Jon's gaze slid beyond her to the heart tree's carved face. The eyes seemed damp and red as wounds. He felt the pull of both names inside him, Jon and Aegon, and of two oaths, to the north that had raised him and the realm that had bled under his watch. The wind shifted, bringing a faint smell of wood smoke and something cleaner from the east. As if the lake at the gods I exhaled through leagues of forest. Davos shifted his weight. Harrenhal's close to the Isle of Faces, he said, practical even in talk of old magic. If there are truths older than the Seven and the Undulls, they lay sleeping there. Some men will be more likely to believe if old trees watch them do it. Sam hugged his oilskin tighter. I have the page, and I think I can find Howland Reed. He flushed at their looks. He was with Lord Eddard at the Tower of Joy. He'd be the last living man who could swear that Lyanna died there, that the baby she bore. Sam faltered and lifted his chin. That you were carried north. Sansa's mouth tightened at the name of Howland Reed, the quiet man of the neck who had let no word creep out all these years. He will come if he means to, she said. The Crannogmen do as they will, but it is Harrenhal nonetheless. The Isle is close. The River Lords will come to Harrenhal. The Vale can ride to it, and the men of the north. Her eyes weighed Jon. If you mean to do this, you must do it before Daenerys moves on King's Landing. Jon tasted ash. If, he said, because that word had iron edges on it, and because there was a woman with silver hair and a will like a drawn bow waiting to be told a truth that would darken her eyes. He found her where the snow had softened to slush and the light came through Winterfell's high tower windows in a flat gray. She stood before a map as men had stood before maps since men had words for land. Her hands on the edge, head bent, hair the color of hoarfrost at dawn. Missandei stood 2 paces behind, hands folded. Grey Worm was a stillness of shadow at the door. Tyrion and Varys were arguing in whispers in a corner, their open glances like knives lightly drawn across a whetstone. You want to call a council, Daenerys said without turning, as if she had heard the words carried by the stones. My hand says a great council will give the realm a voice. The Spymaster says it will give my enemies a stage. It will give the truth a place to be seen, Jon said. She looked up then, and the light caught in her eyes and coolly slid off. She was beautiful the way a drawn sword was beautiful. There was warmth coiled in her, but it was not in the places where one expected to find it. He saw the grief in her, raw still from the pyres at Winterfell and from Yora's final collapse into her arms under a sky ripped by screams. He saw, too, the bone-deep hunger for an end that would not leave her diminished. Truth, she said. You mean to stand up in a hall crowded with men who never bled for me, who called me usurper while I was fighting for them in the snow, and tell them you carry a name that would let them say I am less? I mean to tell them who I am, Jon said, and I mean to ask them to choose, because if we do not, they will choose by blade and ruse across 100 fields. She drew back from the table and came to face him fully. He could smell salt and clean hair oils and the sharp iron scent that clung to armor. They will not choose me, she said, and there was no plea in it, only measurement. Not if you stand in front of them and tell them you are Rhaegar's trueborn son. Tyrion shifted. Varys drew a slow breath and let it out. A cat smelling a kitchen. I don't want it, Jon said, and understood as he said it that wanting was not at the root of this thing at all. Duty was older than will. It had carved him from boyhood. I did not ask for this truth, but it is true. Wanting and truth, Daenerys said with the ghost of a smile that was no smile. My brother wanted since he was old enough to speak. He had no truth in him but his tongue. I had truth and had to want hard enough to live to use it. Take care which you make your God. Missandei's voice, quiet and precise. If Her Majesty attends a council, it will be seen as strength. If she refuses, it will be called fear. The lords could call it in any case without us, and then it would be set against her from the start. Tyrion took a step forward, hands out as though to show he held no daggers. Your Grace, he said to Daenerys, if you can win their love when you might have taken only their fear, your throne will be set on bedrock. Love, Daenerys said, her voice flat as a lake with no wind. She looked back to Jon. And if they choose you, then I will do what you do every day, Jon said. I will find a way that does not burn what I swore to save. Her eyes searched his face, the lines the cold had carved and the old scars and the new ones. She could not see the one that mattered, the brand laid on his soul when he came back from dark. Maybe she felt it anyway. She looked away at last and nodded once, a movement like the jerk of a standard in wind. Harrenhal, she said. 1 week. Ravens flew. Riders pounded south down the King's Road, west through the ragged forests of the Riverlands, east to the Vales Mountains, and long lean boats slipped out of Dire Den and salt pans toward the black shores of the God's Eye. Letters went to White Harbor and Barrowton and Last Hearth, to Riverrun and Seaguard, to the Eyrie and the Gates of the Moon, to what remained of Highgarden and to Old Town's grey stone where the high towers looked out with onion peel eyes, to Storm's End where a boy with a smith's shoulders and a lord's name stared long at each line, to Sunspear where the wind that came off the sea tasted different and the men remembered a princess with eyes like polished jet and a smile that had hidden steel. They came because they were hungry for an end. They came because the stories of Harrenhal had been told and retold by men who had lived long enough to regret surviving. They came because the Isle of Faces lay like a green coin set in the God's Eye and the red weirwoods watched, and men trusted what they could not understand more easily than what they could. The Riverlands wore their scars openly. Jon and his company passed farm fields salted by unintended fires, villages where the houses leaned inward for comfort around wells and the well stones were blackened, and bridges where the planks had been replaced with whatever wood could be cut from the nearest living thing. He rode with Ghost at his stirrup and the wind wet in his hair even when the sky was clear. Sansa rode on a black mare with a white star between its eyes, her back straight, Brienne presence on her left like a walking wall. Arya rode where she liked, slipping forward or back. Sometimes Jon would glance to his side and she would be there without sound, grinning as if they were children again. And sometimes he would think of her and turn and find only snow and horsehair and the memory of a blade as thin as a whisper. Davos kept the column moving with the quiet competence of a lifelong sailor turned road captain. He seemed to know when to press and when to rest, as if he could smell where the world's skin was thin and one could walk lightly without breaking it. Sam rode a short, stubborn gelding and read at night by the light of a brazier, lips moving, oilskin pages cradled like a child. Bran traveled partly in the bodies of crows that rode the wind a mile ahead and partly in his chair, being pushed by a rotating company of men who did not complain and felt they had been touched by something more important than discomfort. Tyrion rode near the front with a fur collar that made him look like a small bear and drank less than men expected, or else more cleverly. Varys traveled in a stout carriage that made Davos grumble at muddy stretches. Sometimes the eunuch would lean out the window, watch the trees slide by, and smile once without humor like a man looking at his own grave and finding it well kept. They reached Harrenhal on a day when the low clouds broke and the sun came down cold and hard. The castle rose from the shore like the burned bones of some leviathan thing. 5 vast towers melted on one side into shapes that the eye could not hold without flinching. Jon had heard the names since boyhood: the Widow's Tower, the Wailing Tower, the Tower of Dread, the Tower of Ghosts, the King's Pyre. Black stone caught the light and showed its skin like obsidian, smooth where dragons had kissed it and eaten its strength. Wind ran through its emptiness and made a sound that had earned it one of its names. They hold councils in places like this because men fear gods less in the company of ruins, Tyrion said, looking up. Also because there are enough rooms. Harrenhal's great hall had space enough to swallow the company of a lord who had not offended dragons. Long trestle tables were set under the banners that had arrived. the trout of Tully over a field of blue and red, the black fish of Blackwood and the red eye of Bracken, glowering at each other across an aisle, the bronze and blue falcon of Arran beside the square-headed bronze of Royce, the golden kraken of Greyjoy that Yara had brought on a mast, planted like a spear in the corner, the sun and spear of Dorne, newly come with a man whose face was smooth as wet stone, the crowned stag of Baratheon done hastily on fresh cloth, the paint still a shade lighter where it had dried unevenly, the dire wolf of Stark, and the three-headed dragon of Targaryen that Daenerys's men had hung where the light would strike it like a red wound. On the first night there was no council, only arrivals and the fever of their arrival. Men measured each other with eyes and stories, each carrying a dozen versions of the truth like knives tucked into sleeves. Edmure Tully came like a man woken from a long dream, with hair thinning, cheeks softer than once they had been, eyes eager. His wife and child stayed at a smaller hall downriver. He would look south sometimes and smile, and then catch himself and tighten his jaw like any lord newly sure of the weight of his name. Yohn Royce came in bronze and old honor, and bowed to Sansa as if she were already the queen of something greater than the North. Yara Greyjoy strode in with her weather-burned men and laughed loud to hide the place's grief had taken bites out of her. And when she saw Jon, she clapped his arm as if he were a ship's mast and said, "A council on dry land? No sea? It will go ill then. Let's drink." Gendry came in wearing a leather doublet too plain for a lord and too fine for a smith, carrying uncertainty like a new tool he had not yet made his hand to. He looked at Jon, and his face lit with the simple relief of seeing someone he trusted. From Dorne came a man with a narrow face, hair coiled back from his temples, ringed fingers that spoke of an old family, and eyes that never forgot to be watching even when the rest of his expression pretended courtesy. He introduced himself as Ser André Corgyle, sent by the prince, who had not yet bothered to attach his name to any letter. The Reach sent 2 men and a woman who could not agree among themselves whether the Hightowers would come or the Hightowers were busy watching Old Town breathe. They broke bread with each other with care. The Westerlands were thinly represented, proud houses bruised by Lannister ruin and soldier cold. Some looked to Tyrion with expressions they had not decided how to shape. Daenerys came 2 mornings later in the scream of wings. Drogon took the sky above Harrenhal like an ink spill across the sun, shadow swallowing shadow. Rhaegal circled lower and huffed steam that glittered. The hall shook as they landed on black stone. The melted towers remembered and wept in their way. Soldiers who had not seen a dragon since Winterfell fell to their knees. Others stood very still and calculated. She came into the hall with Missandei and Grey Worm and the Unsullied at her back, and her hair braided with bells that sounded once and did not dare again. She had left the east long ago, but it lived in the way she moved, as if heat pressed up under her skin. She saw Jon at the far end and did not quicken or slow. The lords watched her like men in a field watch weather change. The day of the council dawned under a high white sky with a wind that came off the lake and slid cold hands down inside collars. Bells were set to ring at noon, not for surrender, for the simple act of beginning. Jon had slept poorly and dreamed of the heart tree weeping sap that froze into tear pearls on the bark and tinkled when the wind blew. He went to the shore of the God's Eye at dawn with Ghost padding beside him and watched the Isle of Faces, a dark, humped-shadowed circle with faint color like blood amongst the trees. "Some say the green men live there still," Davos said, coming to stand beside him. "Some say the weirwoods whisper to each other across the water, and some say that's the wind caught in leaves. Men say many things, but I have never known a lie to grow under white bark. Not for long." Jon looked at the water. It had the color of hammered steel except near the shore where reeds lifted their brown heads and green showed thinly. A flat-bottomed boat moved out from the isle, pushed by silent men with long poles. They came halfway and stopped and did not move again. Ghost turned his head once and huffed, as if to say that some distances were right and should not be closed. They met not in the melted great hall, but in a vast kitchen court with a roof rebuilt not so long ago and stalls along 2 sides where ovens had stood in a time before dragonfire. Men had strung ropes and hung banners and lanterns that made the light soft and warm. The dais was simple. 3 steps up and a long chair that had once been a lord's bench. A maester of Riverrun, bald as a fruit stone and kindly-eyed, had been agreed upon to speak the forms and keep the count. He stood at a lectern and looked out over a sea of faces and hands and jewels and scars. Jon Royce and Edmure Tully opened the council by right of place, host and elder of the Vale, their voices lending the shape of formality to something that might otherwise have broken into shouting. "By the old custom of the realm," Royce said, "we meet to determine the succession when the succession is in doubt and the realm cannot bear war over it." He did not look at Daenerys when he said it, nor at Jon, but at the blackened stones and the rafters that had once heard dragons scream. "We do en. Oti bind men by the faith or the old gods or the lawlers and drowned gods who have fallen out of fashion and then fallen in again. We bind them by the sense of the lords of the realm who must keep their people fed and their lands from becoming battlegrounds." Daenerys was first to speak for herself. She rose with Missandei beside her and Grey Worm behind like a piece of iron set upright and carefully tempered. "I am Daenerys of the House Targaryen, first of my name," she said, and the titles followed like surf. But she let them break quickly and draw back rather than wash the hall. "Daughter of King Aerys, sister of Prince Rhaegar and Prince Viserys, I have bled for this land. My children bled fire for it. I came to your north at the call of a man who called himself your king. I do not set aside what I am because another calls himself something else." Murmur. A ripple moved through men like wind through grass. Yara Greyjoy watched Daenerys with narrowed eyes and half a smile. Gendry's jaw worked like a man keeping a bit in his teeth. Then Jon stood. He had no equal as a figure of sympathy in that hall. That was true. He was a Stark to men who had fought under direwolf banners and an unknown to men who disliked to be told anything new. He was Targaryen in hair darker than expected and in a gravity that pulled eyes the way flame pulled moths. "I am Jon Snow," he said first, because that was the name that didn't crack his tongue when he spoke it. "I was raised in Winterfell by Lord Eddard Stark, who is father in my heart. I fought the dead and watched good men die in rows like wheat. He let the wind blow words from him and then set his back. I am also Aegon Targaryen, son of Rhaegar, trueborn of Lyanna Stark. My father and my aunt were married in Dorne by a septon of the faith. The record of that marriage exists. I did not come south to claim a thing. I did not want it. But I cannot let the realm tear itself apart because the truth was buried with my mother under a tower of stone." He was no orator. It helped. Men believed a man who did not gild himself well enough to be a liar. Sam brought the page out as a squire brings a sword. The oilskin crackled like the skin of something that had been asleep too long. The maester examined seals and hands, murmured to the two other maesters they had agreed upon, one from White Harbor and one from the Vale. Men came to look, a chosen number only, at the insistence of those who believed in the sanctity of old records. And those men nodded and stepped back as if reluctant to be seen agreeing with the parchment itself. "Howland Reed of Greywater Watch," Jon Royce called, and the name struck the room like a stone thrown into a pond. Ripples. Heads turned. A man moved from the shadows near a pillar. He was not tall, not built for looking up to, and he wore leather that had been mended as if a wife had cared to stitch what a man had torn. His hair was threaded with gray and his hands were brown as river wood. He came with a slow confidence, as if the floor belonged to him as much as it did to any lord in gilded mail. "I was at the Tower of Joy," he said, before Jon Royce could give him a speech to stand on. His voice was a reed whisper that carried. "I stood beside Eddard Stark when he took a babe swaddled in blood from his sister's arms. I swore a secret with him. I held it until I could keep it no longer because the boy became a man and the realm needed truth more than I needed my promise." He lifted a thing wrapped in old cloth. He unwrapped it. In his hands lay a chain set with a ring that was older than any man there. A thing of wrought gold given the shape of 3 dragons chased around a ruby that held light and made it bleed. He said simply, "Rhaegar gave this to Lyanna when he wed her. She gave it to me when she died, to hold for the babe's aunt." The words stuck then. He had not told this to himself in the night, it seemed. For Ned's wife to keep without knowing why, because that is what trust is. Kept. Now I return it to his son. He offered it to Jon and did not kneel or bow. Jon took it as if it would heat his palm and found that, indeed, it did. For a breath he saw the Tower of Joy not as he had seen it in Bran's eyes but as a possibility. His mother's hair like a spill of black on white linen, her fingers weak, her eyes fierce and young and dying. Ghost whined, a small sound, and pressed against Jon's knee. They might have believed then, most of them. But belief is one thing and assent is another. The Dornish envoy asked to speak and did so with silk on steel. "Princess Elia was my cousin," he said. "She was set aside by Rhaegar as these records claim, and Dorne swallowed the insult because we are a small realm with long memories. You tell us the faith annulled that first marriage and then married the prince to a northern woman without so much as a peal of bells. You show us a record we cannot test and a ring we cannot prove. If we accept this truth, we must accept that Prince Rhaegar threw my cousin aside like fish bones, and we must accept the gruesome end that followed without even the cold comfort of legitimacy for her children. We are being asked to sanction a story that gives us only salt for our wounds." There was a movement near the back. A swirl in the corner of Jon's. I made him turn. Bran had had his chair brought into the hall after all. He sat near a post cut with gouges where spits had once rested. He looked very small and very plain, the wheel rims dull on the stone. A crow lit on a rafter above him, clicked once, and hopped along the beam. Sansa stood behind him, her hands light on the chair's handles. Bran spoke then, and the hall's air changed. It was not the tone of his voice, it was thin and untrained, but the weight of it. The faith allowed Rhaegar to set aside Elia because he believed prophecy needed a different mother, he said. Men shifted at the word prophecy like horses who hear something move in the brush. Bran's eyes had the distance of ice. That was his sin and his law. He loved Lyanna. He believed. He was wrong in much, but he did not intend slight to Dorne. And Elia Martell's children were not legitimate after that annulment. However much we might wish paper were kinder. He let the words fall and rest. You can hate Rhaegar for it. The world has. But the truth does not bend because we hate men who shaped it. The Dornishman met Bran's eyes and something passed between them that was not forgiveness. We do not need boys to tell us what men did, he said and stepped back a pace. He did not leave. It was as much concession as the day would wrestle from him. They argued in order after that so that the shouting had walls to bounce against. Yara spoke plainly and in few words. Daenerys put a crown on my head and told me to hold my islands. She crossed a world to help you in your snow. She doesn't burn from boredom. She burns because men make her fight for every stone of ground she stands on. Gendry spoke with the quiet intensity of a man who knows the weight of a hammer. Queen Daenerys named me Lord of Storm's End, he said, and the title sounded strange in his mouth, as if he had bitten into a word that was harder than expected. I will not pretend I don't owe her for that, but I grew up in King's Landing, and I know what kings and queens do when they are told no. I've seen it from the gutter up. If the realm chooses and that choice is honored, I'll kneel to that. I'll fight for that. Fire's good when it's in a forge. It makes steel. When it's on your roof at night, it makes ashes. Varys rose when no one seemed to be looking at him and somehow found that everyone was. I am not a lord, he said, and his smile smoothed away again. I have no lands and no banners. I have only the realm. That is what I have always said, and I say it again now at a cost I understand very well. The realm needs mercy more than titles. Choose the one who will spare lives. He did not look at Daenerys or Jon. His eyes slid to the lamps and found only fire there. Tyrion did what men of his sort do when their minds have been a sword and their mouths have been a scabbard and all that's left is the throw. There is another path, he said. The Targaryens have married brother to sister for generations to keep their line straight and their dragons comfortable. That has never comforted anyone else, but it has made sense to them. If the faith set Rhaegar's course aside once, perhaps it is not irredeemable to set it aside again. If Jon Snow and Queen Daenerys agree to marry, the line reconciles itself, the truth remains true, and the realm gets a king and queen both. He paused, letting it settle as a provocation should. There, I have said the indecent part aloud. Decide if you like decency enough to hang yourself with it. The silence after that had a feel like a held breath underwater. Faces moved. Eyes darted and went still. In the corners there was a sound like cloth being wrung out slowly, 100 tiny discomforts. Sansa's lips whitened briefly. Yohn Royce's jaw set so hard it might have cracked. The men of the faith looked at one another with pious alarm and practical calculation. The Dornish envoy's eyes showed a flame deep within, a distant heat. Daenerys had not winced at the suggestion. Her expression did not change. Only her hands had tightened, the knuckles gone white under fine skin. "I offered to share power," she said, and her tone was iron set gentler by a hammer. "I offered warmth. I was offered duty." She looked at Jon. "Would you have me as wife because you desire it, or because it saves blood? Will you put your mouth on mine because a council of men think it tidier?" Jon's breath came slow. Words rose and fell, and he had to hunt down the ones that mattered and drag them into light. "I loved you," he said, inadvertent past tense and then stubborn present. "I love you, but I cannot promise to do what I think wrong because it makes men sleep. I will not lie to a hall, and I will not lie to you. If we choose each other, it has to be for ourselves, not for them." For a heartbeat, something surprisingly soft moved in her face. Then it was gone, hidden carefully in the work of being unbent. "Then we will see whether they choose you or me," she said. "And if they choose you, Jon Snow, son of Rhaegar, will you set aside your sister's pride and chain the North to a throne as it has been chained before?" Sansa's chin lifted and her eyes sharpened, but she did not speak. Jon felt the pull of her, of Winterfell, of the wind in the heart tree and the silence of dead men's names. He felt, too, the pull of those whose faces were turned to him. Bakers in White Harbor, boys in the Vale, an old woman in a Riverlands cottage who had lost 3 sons to 3 kings. "I will not chain what should not be chained," he said at last. "I will ask. I will build something they can hold without bleeding. I will not force it. It was not enough for some. It was too much for others. It was perhaps exactly what it had to be." The maester called for a pause so they could let bread and meat and small beer remind them they were animals meant to live. The pause saved lives, though none of the men who ate knew it then. Arya had noticed the cluster of men around the south doors early in the morning. Strangers in dull brown with the kind of hands that belonged to sailors or smiths, fingernails black with oil. They had stood too close without ever touching, like bits of iron filings oriented by a magnet none could see. When the benches scraped back and men stretched and reached for trenchers, they moved a half-pace nearer the dais in a way that looked natural because it had been practiced in other halls by other hands. She slid along the line of pillars with steps that learned softness, dancing room to room in a house of black and white. Sandor would have snorted to see how she moved. He would have called it sneaking, as if that were beneath her, but she had learned that pride died with the proud and left them with nothing but a lesson too late to spend. She came up beside one of the men and touched the hilt of needle through her sleeve out of habit, then let the feel of its length center her and released it. She had other tools now. They had built scorpions into crates, disassembled into pieces that could be made to look like carpenter's tools and pots and the broken carcass of a wagon. She saw it as they brought the bits together by the wall, and the middle of the hall would have hid them from most men. But she was in corners by nature, and the corners told her things. They meant to fire iron into dragons, but the dais was in their line as well. A bolt might strike Jon before it struck scales, and there would be confusion enough for the second to reach a wing before it reached a chest. Arya did not think about any of this in words. She simply moved. She let the first one slide the cocking lever into place before she broke 2 fingers in his hand and shoved the lever back into a face that met it with a crunch. She let the second think he was faster than a slight girl, and then let the heel of her palm travel up under his rib to a place men could not protect without armor. His breath went out of him like a candle. The third she did not touch at all. She whispered, "Behind you," with such conviction that he turned his head, and she took his knee with the bench he had been leaning on, a crack like a pine bough in winter. By then the first was on his feet again, and the fourth had gotten his wits back and drawn a knife he meant for someone important. The noise rose like a river roaring over a weir. Steel came loose and looked for home. Brienne was there at the dais's foot. her sword singing in a clean line that cut the knife free, and then cut the man from his feet when he lunged again in a way that would have killed a slower woman. Grey Worm moved like the point of a spear, his men closing behind him in a shape that had been drilled into bones. Jon Royce roared and made the sound of boars and battle, bronze catching light that turned it old and mythic. Gendry came over the table with a meat knife and the look of a smith who has been told his work is not good enough. He put it where it would teach lessons. Someone screamed dragon in the wrong way, and men shoved, and some fell, and some ran toward where they should not. Drogon's shadow slid over the roof with a sound like a flag being whipped too hard. He had felt the intent in the men below as if thought had heat. Regal screamed from the yard, iron nails on stone. The scorpion's arm managed to lever once under a hand that had not yet been broken, and a bolt slid free and skittered, skipped like a thrown stone, clanged off a pillar and buried itself to the fletching in a banner. The three-headed dragon of House Targaryen hung oddly afterward, one head pierced through the eye. If any man thought that was a sign, he kept it to himself. It was over as quickly as it had begun. The brown-clad men lay where they had fallen, 3 dead, 2 whimpering, one trying to crawl and make himself disappear by going flat. They came from no house that would claim them. Their hands carried the smell of pitch and the sea. Qyburn's work had reached farther inland than men liked to think it could. Varys had sent looks like touches in all directions, and men had gone to find out what could be known. He would know enough by night to make 5 men die in private, even if none in public did. Jon stood at the edge of the dais with Ghost pressed to his knee and blood slicking the glove where he had struck a face. The crowd's noise fell back to a panting hush. He looked at Daenerys. Her eyes were wide in a face that had forgotten to be a queen's for a heartbeat. She looked young then, and the sight of her dragon's banner torn had raised something in her that was not rage but the thing rage guards. Fear for a child. Then it passed and the armor slid back. Cersei's shape, Tyrion said to no one and everyone. She kills in halls because she cannot win in one. The maester cleared his throat with the authority of a man who had presided over births and deaths and seen both quiet and messy. If we let the day be stolen by fear, he said, gentler than a father and firmer than a lord, we give our choice to the ones who would steal it. We return to order. They did, with more order than they would have had otherwise. Men who had begun to see their opponents as enemies saw instead the bolts in the scorpion, the bruises on Arya Stark's knuckles, the way Grey Worm had placed himself between his queen and the line of fire. The hall felt steadier, as ships do when they find a wind they can trust. The vote was not cast like pebbles in bowls or tokens in jars. They chose a form that balanced the weight of great houses and lesser lords and accounted for the fact that men in the same hall could not pretend to be hundreds from a realm that could not travel. It was disorder made to look like arithmetic, and arithmetic made to look like justice. Maesters crossed out names and wrote them in again with the careful flourish of men who know they write on skin even when the page is calf. Before the count, men stood and bound their words to their names. Jon Royce pledged the veil to the decision. Edmure spoke with more eloquence than men expected and said that the Riverlands were tired, and tired men did not swing swords straight. The Dornish envoy spoke again to say that even if Dorne could not love the shape of truth brought into the hall, it would not refuse to recognize it. Yara said she would split any man from crotch to crown who did not honor the vote, and some men laughed but more believed. Gendry took a long time to stand. When he did, he looked at Dany and then at Jon and then down at his hands. I was a bastard, he said. I'm not ashamed of it. I made good iron and I ate and I kept going, and sometimes that's all any of us have. The queen gave me a name. I won't forget that. The man. He shook his head and started again, simpler. The realm should choose. I choose Jon. I'll follow him if you tell me to. I'll follow you if you tell me to. But I'll follow peace if that's an order on offer. Daenerys had not moved. When called, she stood and said, I choose myself because I must choose myself. She did not dress it. She let the steel be steel and did not try to make it silk. Sansa stood and said, the North will honor the vote. We bled at Winterfell for the realm. We will not be asked to bleed for a king who forgets us. If Jon is chosen, he will keep his word. And she let her eyes pin him and did not hide the iron in her. If Daenerys is chosen, she will need to remember her promises to all the realms, including mine. The Maester called the roll, and men put their names under choices, and the room breathed in and out like a beast sleeping. The count took an hour from beginning to done, and in that hour men thought about wheat and walls and winter that would come again whether there were Targaryens to see it or not. It was not close enough to split the hall. It was not so wide that anyone could pretend the losing side had not mattered. When the Maester spoke, his voice steadied and he looked at the two who would bear the weight. By the custom of the realm and in the sight of those gathered, the council recognizes Aegon Targaryen, called Jon Snow, as heir of Rhaegar Targaryen and the rightful claimant to the Iron Throne, he said. With the proviso that he honor the liberties of the North he has sworn to honor. He lowered his head a fraction toward Daenerys, not in condescension but in acknowledgement. Queen Daenerys Stormborn of the House Targaryen is recognized as preferred by near a third of the assembly. The council calls upon both to honor this decisio, and preserve the peace of the realm. There was a sound then like wind through fields, a long exhale, not triumphal, not despairing. Men reached for cups. Some wept without wanting to and said they were sneezing. Grey Worm's eyes slid to Daenerys as if to fix in his head what his sword might be asked to do. Missandei's lips pressed together and color rose and then fell away in her cheeks. Tyrion stood very still with his hands on the back of a chair and looked like a man who has been carrying a heavy thing and finds it now set down where it might roll. Jon did not feel joy. He felt a weight and knew what it was. He looked at Daenerys and saw how she stood in the middle of men who were not hers, alone as he would have been alone had the count gone the other way. He crossed the space between them with the hall watching. Ghost stayed at the base of the dais and watched everything because that was his work. He went to one knee in front of her. The sound men made in the hall then had surprise in it and something else. "Your Grace," he said, and he put the ring Howland had given him, the three-headed dragon wrapped around a ruby, into both his hands as if it weighed more than it did. "This is mine by blood and yours by fire. We are not enemies. I will not be your enemy. The council has chosen me to lead the realm. I ask you to lead it with me." He was not asking for marriage. He was asking for something that did not have a shape in old songs, and the difficulty of that frightened men more than talk of dragons ever had. It frightened them because it was new and required them to be new, and men do not like to be asked to change shape unless the change leaves them handsomer. Daenerys's breath lifted her chest. The bells braided in her hair chimed once, soft and sharp. She did not take the ring. She set her hand on it lightly, over his, and he felt the tremor in her fingers and was careful not to let his own be anything but steady. "The council chose you," she said. "If I lead with you, I am not queen. You are Daenerys," he said quietly, meant for her more than for the hall. "And you are what you have made yourself. Titles are tools. We can name you queen in council. We can name me king. We can make a charter and write it down, and men will read it when they argue over wheat. None of that is the work. The work is keeping children from dying when they don't have to. It is making sure that when a man goes to bed in the Reach, he does not wake to find his field burned by a quarrel in the capital. It is knowing when to unsheath a sword and when to let it rust a day longer." He saw the war in her then, between the girl who had walked through fire and learned she was proofed against it, and the woman who had learned that not all flame cleansed. She lifted her hand. She could have clutched the ring and made a symbol. She did not. She touched his knuckles instead. Once, as a woman might touch a lover's cheek in a room no one else was allowed into. Then she let her hand fall. "I will not kneel to you," she said. The last plank she could not pull up without breaking the bridge she had built in herself. "But I will not break the realm to make it kneel to me." She turned to the hall. Her voice rose. "Hear me. Westeros loves its forms. Love them then. Keep your councils and counts. I will take my armies and my dragons and help you remove a woman who strangles the city in the south. When the bells ring in King's Landing, they will be for surrender, not for fire." Her eyes returned to Jon. "And when the city opens its gates, we will speak again in a hall without fear and decide what shapes we must be to do as you say." It was as much as he could have asked and more than she had wanted to give. The hall found a sound for it that was careful, as if men were testing ice by stamping lightly. The decision did not end anything. It made the start of another thing, as decisions do. That night the lake lay like black cloth, and the Isle of Faces was a smudged coin on it. Someone's thumbprint pressed into mourning. John went alone with Ghost to the shore and listened to reeds and remembered lines of an old man's story about green men that Sam had told long ago when they were boys on Cold Stone. He heard steps behind him and did not need to turn to know it was Sansa. "You could have taken it all," she said. "You could have demanded her knee in front of every lord. You could have been the only name in their mouths by dawn." John did not answer at once. He watched a wind move in a black line across the surface, from west to east, as if something swam there. "I'm not hungry for that," he said. "I'm hungry for quiet." Sansa stood very close, her sleeve brushing his. She lifted a hand and let her fingers rest on Ghost's skull, and the direwolf closed his eyes. "Quiet is short in our family," she said, "but there's a way to have more of it than we've known. When you write your charter, write one that sets the North apart." He had known this was coming. She had waited until the first fierce pass of the day had rolled away so that the words would not seem like a quarrel over spoils. "The men of the North have bled in fields with no grain to take," Sansa said. "We have kept our gods. We have endured winter. Let us be your friends and not your subjects." John turned then and met her gaze. She had become something her childhood would not have recognized. She had a steel in her that did not need showing off. "I promised," he said. "I meant it. I would not chain what should not be chained." He took a breath and gave the only gift he had, a promise made of old oak. "The North will stand apart. We will write it. We will live it." She nodded once, and the tension in her mouth softened. "You will have trouble with the South," she murmured, humor creeping a little into her voice. "Men like to be told their queen is a woman who will set them on fire rather than a woman who will learn not to." He huffed a laugh that had felt impossible an hour before. "I have always found that men like being told things more than they like being the thing they are told," he said. "We will make do." They made do. The days after the council were filled with meetings that felt like trying to build dry shoes while walking through a swamp. Men who had thrown in with John tried to make sure their throw bought them influence. Men who had been disappointed tried to keep their disappointment honorable, so that it would not curdle and poison the drink everyone had to share. The Dornish envoy sent a letter in a tight hand that said the prince acknowledged the decision and that Dorne would send spears when the general call was made. The Reachers who had come bickered until one of them, a short woman with hair like straw and a stare that made grown men forget jokes, stood up and said, "We will choose a voice and not divide like pastry," and the other two shut their mouths and let her speak for them. The Vale men were steady and measured. The River Lords were anxious. The Ironborn loud in corridors and grim in courtyards. The Westerlanders guarded. Varys vanished into rooms where men talked too softly and emerged with a simple report. Euron Greyjoy puts scorpions on every stretch of wall that can bear them. Qyburn does not sleep and does not require those that serve him to sleep either. The Golden Company has arrived outside the city and sets its tents as precisely as any September Cersei's people are whipped and fed. There are more words written in the bowels of the Red Keep than there have been in a year. She is making an accounting of what she will lose and what she will burn to make that loss acceptable. Tyrion stood with Jon one evening and watched the sunset turn the melted towers into silent, glowing candles. "There is still the matter of how we do this," he said. "We can march together and lay siege and hope that the smell of shit and smoke in the city makes it surrender faster than pride makes it hold. We can try to sneak men through postern gates and end it in a hallway with a dagger and then see who believes in council after the fact. We can fly dragons and breathe fire until the bells ring or until they don't and your promises become ash." Jon had always thought he was a man of winter rather than choices, but the last years had taught him that winter is full of choices. Who to feed, who to save, which fire to keep going when there is not wood enough to light more than one. "We ask," he said. "We send to the city and we tell them what the council decided and why. We tell them the queen who sits there was not chosen. We ask them to open their gates and let us remove her. We swear to keep their children safe. We have the lords who sat here put their names under it. We don't try to be clever. We try to be clear. Tyrion's mouth twisted. Clarity has never been a Lannister's friend, he said softly, and did not say the names he was tasting. They wrote the letter. It was a piece of parchment as long as a forearm and heavy with the ink of names. 7 great lords, 8 old houses newly lifted by death's harvest, 6 smaller lords whose words were blunt and honest, and 1 foreign queen who had burned her titles down to the truth and signed that she would not burn the city. A blacksmith's lordly stag appeared under Gendry's awkward signature where he had taken too long to draw it well and then laughed at himself and let it stand. Sansa wrote clean as winter air and placed the direwolf next to her name. The Dornish envoy added a yellow sun and a spear without naming which prince he spoke for, as if to remind them foreigners had long memories and would keep their own counsel in their own houses. The page smelled like iron and wax. They sent it on a fast horse and a faster raven, because it was a thing that should reach men from the sky and the ground at once. They marched to King's Landing with 2 dragons in the sky and 2 banners at their fore. The wolf and the dragon, red and white and black, and in between them a plain white cloth with no sigil, because sometimes symbols need space to remain symbols. The host was not so large as it might have been because men were tired and food was shorter than mouths, but it was large enough to look like a river in armor when it moved. On the last night before they came within sight of the city walls, Jon could not sleep and walked the lines. He found Arya sitting on a fallen tree with a bit of bread and a strip of meat between her teeth, chewing like a wolf, thinking about something that wasn't hunger. "Do you mean to go in and kill her?" he asked, because their quiet was old enough to carry simple questions. "She's on my list," Arya said. "There are fewer names on it now." She swung her legs. "I took some off because they died. Some because I saw their eyes and decided I wanted to sleep more than I wanted to see them stop moving." She looked over at him, her face thinner and older than he remembered from the day she had poked him with a practiced sword in the yard. "If the gates open and she stands down, I'll let her live. And if she does not?" Jon asked. Arya smiled, and it was not the sweet smile of a lady. "Then the Hound and I have unfinished business," she said. "If he's willing. And you have dragons." Jon grunted and sat beside her. He did not speak for a while. Ghost lay down with a sigh and put his head on Jon's boot and snored once like a bellows. "I told Sansa we should write down what we mean to build," Jon said at last. "We'll have to, or this will happen again in a generation and again after that until the stones get tired." "Stones don't tire," Arya said. "People do. It's the people we need to write about." She stretched her arms above her head and yawned hugely, and for a heartbeat he saw the girl who had stolen food from the kitchens and laughed when cooks chased her. "Write a line that says girls are allowed to learn to use swords, and a line that says if a lord starves his people he sleeps in a cell until they have bread again." She looked up at the sky and the bright scatter of stars as clean as flour thrown on a black board. "Write one that says there's always going to be a gate nobody expects, and someone like me is going to find it." At dawn they saw the city walls and the spikes of scorpions like thorns set to catch a falling horse. The red keep looked like old blood that had dried on a knife. The broken sept still yawned like a lost tooth in the smile of the hill. Men moved on the walls slowly and precisely. Cersei's people had been drilled to fear imprecision. They made a show that was not a show. 2 dragons circling and not spitting fire, lines of men formed and not advancing, heralds riding under a white cloth to the gate with the letter held up for all to see. Tyrion went close because he had to, because the shape of his life had bent toward this hill for years, and because he was the one who knew where the hard places were. The bells did not ring at once. Tyrion stood in sight of the gate and felt the heat of his fear and the cold of his hope, and licked chapped lips and thought of Shay with a clenched ache that surprised him, and then let it go because there was no use in that now. The gate's portcullis creaked. A hand came out and took the letter as if it were a viper and might strike. A voice from behind the gate asked a handful of questions that had been prepared and ticked off. Tyrion answered. The hand withdrew. The gate did not move. The city held its breath. On the wall above the gate, men stood behind scorpions with eyes fixed on the dome of a dragon's head that could rise above the horizon at any moment. In alleys and courtyards, Women with small children pressed their backs to cool walls and listened to the sound of nothing happening, with prayers and curses tangled up in one breath. Up on the ramparts of the Red Keep, Cersei Lannister stood in a dress the color of an old bruise and stared at the line of men and banners and the curve of dragons in the pale sky. Her hands were steady on the stone. Qyburn stood behind her, attentive and odious and clever. The sound that reached them was not the drumbeat of horses or the howl of men, but the thin, insistent calling of a single bell, then another that joined it, and then another, until the city began to ring just as the letter said it should when surrender came. Qyburn turned to her with a complexion even paler than usual. "Your Grace," he said, "perhaps we might." She did not answer him. She stared at the line where the north met the south, and at the dragons that were not falling, and at the thought of her child that may or may not have been growing within her, and at the memory of all the ways she had held power and lost it. She shut her eyes, and when she opened them she was a woman again and not a queen. She motioned with one hand. "Open the gate," she said, her voice a dry bone. Qyburn bowed his head and vanished like a roach into shade. The gate opened. The white cloth went up. A sound went down the lines, like relief, like pain, like a cry made in bed alone at night and then choked off. Jon did not move at first. He let the moment be a moment and not a rush toward swords. Then he turned to Daenerys. She had taken one step forward, as if her body had wanted to lean into the idea of fire and had found itself without flame to feed on. "We do it your way," she said, a wry curve to her mouth that had no joy in it but did have a kind of hard respect. "We show mercy." They walked into the city together on foot, with swords at their sides and the dragons on the high air. Men watched from windows with white faces. Women peered out. Children stared as if a story had come home. There were Kingsguard in gold at the foot of the Red Keep steps, and there were men in ragged leather with knives tucked into sleeves at the corners of every square. They came without going down on their knees to Daenerys or to Jon, but they did not draw steel. And this was as much peace as the capital had seen in many years. It was in a wide room with a floor of red stone that they found Cersei at last, without her crown, with her hair grown out to a short pale halo, without makeup, with the lines of her life unsoftened. She looked at Jon the way men look at snow they have been told is beautiful and know will only break roofs. She looked at Daenerys as if at a mirror in which she had refused to see herself while younger and now could not look away. "You have taken my city," she said. "My father would say burn it. My brother would say play it like a game of tiles. My children would have said something kind, and I would have called them soft when I thought it to myself and loved them for it anyway." She let her eyes move to Tyrion and hold there. "Do you think I will do what your letter asked?" "You have," Tyrion said softly. The bells told the truth as truly as any Maesters script. She laughed without mirth. "I did not order them rung," she said. "The city ordered itself. That will be a lesson for you, dwarfling. Cities are beasts with their own minds. Sometimes they agree to be ridden. Sometimes they throw you." She looked at Daenerys, and something old and childlike and furious showed. "Your father wanted to burn them. Mine would have put them in debt and called it mercy. I have been both of them. I am finished with that work." She did not beg. She did not plan a speech that would save her. She did not run. She lifted her chin and put her hands out, and some of the men in the room breathed in as if they had seen bravery and could not say so because they had spent so long calling this woman monster for their safety. She said, "Do what you are going to do." Jon looked at Daenerys. She looked at him. It was not his place to judge the woman who had unmade so much of his life. He had come to stop the killing, not to make more of it. It was also not Daenerys's place to burn the shape of a future into justice. In the end, the choice was made by something that had been growing in both of them since the hall in Harrenhal, when they had let the will of the realm shape what would come and refused to be smaller than that. Daenerys said, "A cell," and Jon nodded once, and the room exhaled. Cersei walked between two soldiers who did not need to hold her arms. She did not look back. Tyrion whispered, "Thank you," without knowing to whom he said it. The days that followed were a winter of paper. They kept the city alive with bread and quiet and the strength of numbers that meant a rumor could be smothered by truth before it grew teeth. They began writing in earnest. The Charter of Harrenhal, men called it because names matter and because cooks need something to call a thing when they stir it in a pot. It said that henceforth, when succession was contested, a great council would be called without waiting for ruin to make it necessary. It said the North was a realm in its own right, friend to the crown, bound by treaty rather than by chain, as long as the crown abided by the charter and did not seek to bind them by sharp practice. It wrote into law things that had been custom in some places, that a lord who starved his people answered to a court not of his friends, that Maesters did not serve lords alone but the land they ate from and would record its needs with as much care as they recorded its births, that the faith would be consulted but would not rule, that dragons were not a right to terror but a responsibility with teeth. Sam helped by making the language clean. He had a gift for that, for finding the simplest word that still carried the truth. Davos helped by saying, "That's all very pretty, but what do you mean to do when a sick cow is walking among 5 healthy ones?" And forcing men to write specific barn doors and fences into law. Tyrion helped because his mind could find holes, and then plug them with a handful of gravel and a laugh. Sansa helped by reading every line as if it were written with hunters in the forest looking for loopholes to hide in. Arya helped by suggesting that any thinking that depended on men being good should be glazed with the expectation that they aren't. And she proposed a corps of inspectors who owed no house and whose coin came from a central fund and who answered in rotation to the lords and the commons by lot. Daenerys helped by insisting that famine be treated as war and answered with the same vigor. When men looked askance at a queen's interest in porridge, she told them that any house that could not cook enough should relinquish kitchens until it learned how. Jon helped by refusing to let anything be written that would make men reach for swords before they reached for ink. The day they finished the first draft, the lake lay bright as a hammered shield and men had stopped looking at the sky whenever a shadow passed. Jon went back to Harrenhal to put his hand where his word had been given. They brought the charter to the kitchen court and read it aloud because men should hear what binds them. The wind lifted the corners of pages and made them flutter like wings. When the last clause had been spoken, men looked at one another and nodded and frowned and squinted as they would at a tool new to their hands. "Now we must see if it works," Davos said. "Laws are boats. You don't know what they're worth until you put them on water." On the black stone of the dais, Daenerys stood beside Jon. She wore no crown. She had braided her hair back from her face and put away the bells. "I still do not bend," she said to him under the noise of men talking. "But I am not unmoved." "I do not ask you to bend," he said. "I ask you to stand with me, for now, for as long as it takes to build this thing into something that can stand without us." She looked at him a long time. Her eyes were still winter blue and hot as a coal that had burned under ash all night. "We will be each other's temptation if we try to build this together," she said. "We will be each other's ruin if we try to have it and the other. I am tired of ruin." He understood. He touched the back of her hand briefly with the tips of his fingers, a gesture that could have been nothing but respect and was also farewell. "Then we will give them peace," he said. She smiled without showing teeth. "And break the wheel," she said softly, "by handing it to them and walking away." The crow on the rafter above Bran's chair clicked twice as if counting. They took Cersei to a small tower with a narrow window that showed only sky and made sure she had bread and water and a bed that did not smell of rot. She slept there and thought of the shape of her life and of the ways she had been strong and had been weak. She did not weep often but did once, a short, violent thing that left her throat raw. When the day came to decide her fate, the council that had made Jon king and made Daenerys something new gathered again and tried hard to remember that mercy is not weakness and that justice means nothing if it is only a slower knife. "She will be tried," Sansa said, and looked at Tyrion when she said it because he had request written in his face, "by judges chosen by lot from among the lords who did not fight for her and the people of the city she ruled. Her sentence will be set by the law. That is what we wrote. That is what we do." It was a cold day when they brought Cersei out, and she looked at the faces and saw in them not love and not hatred. She saw calculation, curiosity, a small satisfaction in some at seeing a mighty thing bowed without breaking. The nearest thing to pity came from Arya, who had pruned a list down to almost nothing and had learned something about killing along the way that made her look at an enemy and see, occasionally, a person. Arya approached Cersei with the kind of ease one brings to a dangerous animal when feeding it. "If I kill you now," Arya said softly, "it will be a story I tell myself to sleep. It will not make me sleep better." Cersei laughed a small laugh and coughed when the cold caught. "Tell yourself better stories," she said, and Arya grinned and went away. The trial took 3 days. Men spoke of wildfire and cruelty and shrewdness and fear. Cersei did not deny much. She said little. In the end, the sentence was not death. It was exile to a silent keep on a lonely stretch of coast, with a dozen women to attend her and none to serve as servants alone. She would not have power again. She would live. It felt like an insult to some and like a prayer answered to others. It felt like the kind of choice men only make when they believe the world can be made differently than it has been. It was, then, exactly the right choice for that moment. When it was done, life did what it always does. It insisted. Houses were repaired. Latrines were dug because they had to be. A boy ran through a market and fell and skinned his knees and got up howling, and his mother picked him up and kissed his forehead and called him an idiot and a treasure in one breath. Men sowed winter wheat because the weather held long enough to let them believe it might come up in time. The dragons flew over the city sometimes, their shadows sliding across stone and skin, and did not spit fire. People looked up and learned to keep walking again without flinching. Jon returned to the north with Ghost and with letters and with a charter that Sansa took in both hands. He went to the Godswood and stood beneath the heart tree and told his father's carved face what he had done. And the wind moved and the leaf tips brushed, and he felt as close to a blessing as a man like him was likely to get. He did not call himself king when he walked Winterfell's halls. Men called him that anyway, some with more comfort than others. He did not wear a crown. If he wore anything, it was the look of a man who has laid down a burden he can still feel in his shoulders. Daenerys took ships and men to Meereen and Astapor and to the cities that had known her mercy and her fire. She did not stay. She saw that they did not slide backward the instant her eyes were turned, and then she set governors and wrote charters and left them to stand or fall by their own work. She returned to Dragonstone for a season and watched the sea and did not light the sky with rage. There were nights she sat on a parapet and thought of a man who had knelt in a ruined hall and handed her a ring he could have kept. There were mornings she woke and did not think of anything but the sea and the sun on it and the work that waited. Tyrion served Jon for a time and then asked to be let go. "I have been a hand so often I think my fingers have grown short," he said. "I want to see what else I am." Jon nodded and clapped him on the shoulder, and Tyrion went to the Riverlands and then to the Reach and wrote a book and then another about wine and words and where they fail each other and did not marry and did not die for many years. Varys continued to know things and to use the knowledge to keep famine from becoming plague and plague from becoming an excuse to empty poor parts of cities and burn them. He smiled sometimes, that odd smile like a scar that never quite fades. He kept a fire in a brazier in a small office and warmed his hands over it on nights when the wind cut and thought that he had served a realm and been served by it, and that this was as good as men like him got. Gendry learned to speak in halls without losing the truths in his mouth. He married a girl from the Stormlands who could hold a sword and a child at the same time and laughed at himself when he made mistakes. He built a forge that turned out plowshares and grades and the occasional sword if the commission was honorable, and he always looked at the swords a heartbeat longer. Yara sailed more than she stayed and enjoyed it. She took lovers where she found them. She returned to the Iron Islands and built piers and ships and told stories of the way a hall had been saved by a girl with a little sword and a boy with a lion's wit and a man who would not be king if it meant he would be a bad one. Arya left and went west because that was the shape of her heart. She looked for what lay where the maps ran out. Sometimes a raven came back with a scrap of parchment tied to its leg and a line that said, "Water enough, no people yet. I ate something I could not name. It tasted good." Sansa read them and smiled privately and once took the note to the Godswood and tucked it in a knothole because even old trees need new stories. Bran lived a long while and became a king of sorts without a throne and a boy of sorts without a childhood. He watched the ravens and walked the halls and learned that men will always forget the cost of the wars they did not fight, and he learned to remind them in ways that did not taste like ash. Howland Reed went home to the Neck and sat with his wife and told her the story of the day the promise broke and the world did not. She listened with her hand on his knee and looked out across the water to where cranes stood on one leg and pretended to be asleep. "You did what you were meant to," she said. "A promise is a living thing. It needs feeding." He kissed her palm and said, "So it does." And John raised no emerald city, carved no clever sayings onto stone. He visited villages and listened until listening hurt and then listened more. He took counsel and made mistakes and said he had made them aloud in halls where men could hear him, and that, more than wisdom, made men forgive him most days. He rode to the sea when it stormed and let the salt whip his face clean, and he rode to the edge of the haunted forest when the light slanted through the trees and the air smelled like night, and he did not cross the old lines because there is some wisdom in leaving old lines alone. He sat with Ghost's head on his knee by the fire and warmed his hands and said a man's prayers to gods he could never fully name. On a fog-laced evening years after bells had rung for surrender instead of slaughter, he returned to Harrenhal with a small company. Sansa, grown into the full measure of what she was. Sam, thicker around the middle and happier for it. Davos, slower and as sharp-eyed as ever. Tyrion, thinner and content in a way that looked like a joke he finally thought funny. Daenerys, or the idea of her, reflected in the memory of a woman he had known and would always know even when she was not at his side. They stood in the kitchen court and looked up at the melted towers and at the rafters that had once heard fear and now listened to wind. A new charter hung there, cleanly written, the ink not yet so old it had faded. It said the council would meet again if needed, and it said all the things they had learned since the last time, because law is a thing you make right by making it again each time you find where it has worn thin. 70 kings in 100 years, Tyrion said. Or fewer, or more, who can tell? But they will have to write as much as they fight now. Davos snorted. Men will always rather swing steel than scratch a feather, but they'll learn, he said. They can be made to. Sansa looked at Jon and raised her brows slightly in an expression that said, both in jest and in love, go on then, speak, because that is why they look at you. He did not speak a speech. He put his hand on the cool black stone and said what mattered into it, as if the castle were a man who would remember. We will not burn and call it victory, he said. We will not starve and call it justice. We will not break what we can hold together. We are not gods. We are men and women who mean to do better. The wind caught his words and ran them out over the god's eye. On the Isle of Faces, the trees stood with their white arms raised, and if they heard, they did not say. It was enough that men heard. It was enough, this once, that when the bells rang it was for beginnings and not for ends.